Okay, on behalf of staff and board and PMI, I'd like to welcome you all here to the Victorian History Library and to our event tonight. Lovely to have you here. My name, for those of you who haven't met before, is Judy Ellis. I'm President of the Library. And on behalf of us all here tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight. The PMI is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Cumberland Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to welcome our guest tonight, Dr James Donaldson. And if you haven't had a chance already to look at these fabulous artefacts, make sure you do afterwards. Before we hear from James, just a couple of administrative things. The bathrooms, if you go out just the door where you came in here and round the corner, the bathroom's there just on the left-hand side. And emergency exits, we have one outside the doors to my right and also down the end of the corridor, and another one out the main doors behind you. Of course, if it's an emergency, the library staff will help direct you out of the building. If you haven't been to the library before, it's the second oldest library in Victoria, founded in 1854, and we collect all aspects specifically of Victorian history, along with interstate and national material that impacts or includes or informs the history of Victoria. We've got over 40,000 items on site, and most of these are available for loan. And we're the only for loan type of collection of its type in the country. And our core collection is local history, and we hold information on most towns in Victoria. So during this presentation, we will be taking photos and also video, which will be posted online, so you can always view it again later or tell your friends. If anybody doesn't want to be included in a photo or a video, let me know and we can make sure we work around that. And of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So this event is part of the Australian Heritage Festival, most of which starts in about 5 or 6 days' time, but there's a great array of events that are on as part of that festival that celebrate and explore the theme of shared stories, which gives me just the right point to introduce you, James, who is a well-known author and an expert on sheep shearing, and he's going to share some of his stories with us tonight about the romance and development of the Australian wool industry in the 19th century, some trends in the growth of time. And as you can see, James has written a number of books, including quite a few on the history of the wool industry, which I believe is influenced, or no doubt influenced, by your past work in the wool sheds of Australia, which I hope we'll hear about as well. On the topic of romance and wool, I must confess that I did come across an article by J.F. Guthrie, who is a member of the Australian Wool Board. And this article was in the Argus newspaper on the 31st of May 1939, so 20th century, not 19th, but it was headed Romantic History of Wool Industry, Australia Rides to Affluence on the Sheep's Back. So please welcome James to talk to us today about the romance and development.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to point out I'm not an expert, but I'm very interested in sheep and wool, and I know something about it, and that's good. In my hand, I'm holding up the old-fashioned Australian shilling. Now, this merino ram was probably one of the most famous rams in Australian history, apart from the sheep that Once a Jolly Swagman stole, or the ram on top of the Golden Fleece petrol station. I think this is probably the best known ram in Australia. It didn't have a name, but it had a number, 0.1. And it was brought up on a big property on the Murrumbidgee called Torgamayne. And directly across the Murrumbidgee from Torgamayne is Burrabogie. And they both appear in that well-known song, I Shore at Burrabogie and I Shore at Torgamayne. There were very big wool sheds and very big properties. In fact, in 1875, when the auctioneer was trying to sell Burrabogie, he said, "Gentlemen, I'm not trying to sell you a sheep station. I am selling you a principality. And that was right, because a lot of these sheep stations were bigger than some little countries in Europe. They were absolutely enormous. You could ride across them all day and still be on the one property. I think the other thing too is that Burrabogie was just an absolutely fantastic big place, but it wasn't the biggest. The Australian Pastoral Company in Queensland used to shear 800,000 sheep every year. And places like Milo and northern New South Wales and Fairbairn, they all had properties which had 500,000 or 600,000 sheep. I've got a little thing in one of my books. It's a sheep dip, and it's like a little bathtub. It's like that size. And it holds 70 gallons of water. And it says, every farmer should have one, because you can dip 300 sheep a day in it. But if you have 800,000 sheep, can you work out? 300 a day, 10 days to do 3,000, 100 days to do 3,000 and 30,000, and then 300. You'd be dipping sheep in this little pond every day for years and years, and some would still be sight. Australia didn't start off as a sheep station. It started off as a jail. And so when the people under Governor Phillip first arrived in 1788, they had no interest in developing the backlands over to the west of the Blue Mountains. They had no idea that there was another side to the Blue Mountains. All they wanted was a safe place to keep convicts. They couldn't run away because you had the Pacific Ocean on one side, you had the Blue Mountains on the other side, and very little room to run away north or south. The last thing that the convict governors wanted was to have people running away. The other big problem, of course, is that the Blue Mountains is very inhospitable. No water, very rugged, very hard if you're not a true bushman. And so most of them who ran away either died or came back very thin after 3 weeks trying to find China. One of these things. In 1813, Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson, they went over the mountains, partly because Blaxland was looking for sheep country. And they started off and they were away for 6 weeks and they crossed the mountains. It was followed by Evans and then followed by Oxley. And they got a view of what was beyond the mountains to look at the Bathurst Plains. Now, there's lots of things about Australia that you know, and there might be some things about Australia that you don't know. And this is something I learned. Coming from Scotland, if there's a map with a big, thick blue line showing a river, you know there's water in it. And to show the big lake, big blue circle, they've got water in it. But that doesn't relate to Australia. A lot of the rivers in Australia have no water in them and never flow on a regular basis. Another thing you might not have known about Australia. Can you imagine a map? If that was New South Wales there, and that's the Pacific Ocean there, and that's the coastline, and that's the convict colony there, and here you have the Great Dividing Range. There is not one river that rises on the eastern side of the mountains that flows inland. Not one. There's not one river that rises on the eastern side of the mountains and flows westward. All the rivers, like the Shoalhaven, the Clarence, the Richmond, the Hawkesbury, etc., all flow into the Pacific. All the rivers that rise on the western side of the Great Divide, they all flow westward, northwards, And eventually most of them finish up in the Murray River, flowing into the sea at South Australia, as if there's not a river bank there. So that's an interesting thing. And so when they came to expand westward into New South Wales with sheep, there was no river like the Nile or no river like the Amazon that they could take supplies up. And that was the trouble. When people like Oxley or Evans, we'll say Oxley, they had to get convicts who would bring piles and piles and piles of stores to Bathurst before they could even walk westward. But everything they took with them, they had to carry. They took boats where there was no water to sail the boats on. And so they had to abandon the boats and often abandon their stores as well. Exploration in Australia depends what time of the year you go. For example, all the rivers that ran westward, down the western side of the Great Divide, were very quick and very fast, but they were not navigable. You couldn't sail a boat on them. And if you look at rivers like the Lachlan, the Macquarie, etc., they don't go anywhere. When Evans first got to Bathurst, he saw the Fish River, he saw the Campbell River, he saw the Lachlan River and the Macquarie, and that was good, wasn't it? He called the two rivers after the governor, Lachlan, Macquarie. I think he was going to get a bit of a step up as a result, but none of the river went anywhere. The Lachlan finishes up in a swamp around Maud, and the Macquarie finishes up in the Macquarie marshes. And so everybody thought then that that was where the sea was. They thought that all the water were collecting in a big sump, a big inland depression that they called the Inland Sea. And when Oxley tried to get through, he was up to his chest in water and couldn't move forward one bit, whereas 4 or 5 months later, when Charles Sturt did it, he was dry-shod and could walk as far as he could. But both Mitchell and Sturt, who were looking for the Darling, they often walked down the Castlereagh River completely dry. There was not a spit of water in the whole river. And yet, if they looked 40 feet above their heads, they could see the debris from massive floods that had once taken place, but they couldn't find any water whatsoever. The reason I'm giving you this little geography test was that when the people in 1818, under Macquarie's leadership, moved westward with their sheep flocks, they didn't go to settle. They actually tried to overland to Melbourne, because Melbourne had just started off in the early 1830s. And so people overlanded. Now, cattle are much better than sheep at overlanding, because they could travel further, they're bigger animals. But when William Broadrib, they would gather all these mobs of cattle near Yass, but then they had to travel 600, 700 kilometers over empty country to get to the northern parts of Victoria, Port Phillip district. That's a long way to go. Broadrib said that as he travelled, and he's really sort of travelling down the route of the Hume Highway, he's talking about from Dundagai down through Albury, to Victoria. There was nothing on his right-hand side as he went around and south. There was nothing, no occupation by white settlers, because they didn't think that stock could be open and be well fed on saltbush. They were wrong, but that's what they thought. When these overlanders were going through the country to Melbourne, they saw lots of Aborigines, but the Aborigines didn't attack them because they knew that they weren't going to stay there. They were just camping en route down the way. But when these people stopped and they started knocking down trees and building stockyards and fencing and building up farm building, then the Aborigines realized that they were being displaced and replaced. And it wasn't a case of an invasion so much as two cultures arguing or fighting about the same resource. That was the big problem. I mean, the Aborigines couldn't understand why. They still couldn't live on the land and kill kangaroos, etc. And the white people thought, hey, you're not supposed to be here because I've bought this land for 10 pounds, huge. And they got chased off. So that's what started the fight. It was very unfortunate. It was a clash of culture and it was a clash of dominance. And I think you can say that the European firepower was a lot stronger than the Aboriginal capacity to resist, until the Aborigines gradually were pushed off the land and it was replaced by pastoral people. Once the Blue Mountains had been crossed, nobody went back to Sydney with their wool. You couldn't get your wool back to Sydney because the Blue Mountains, it was just inhospitable. There was no water. It was too rough. In fact, some people used to drive their sheep up to Katoomba and shear their sheep so that the wool could go down one side and the sheep could go back down the other. It was quite remarkable. But once they discovered that you could overland to Melbourne and get supplies there, then most of the supplies came that way. For example, it would take 2 or 3 months for a sheep station to send down to Melbourne to get their foodstuffs and their station supplies and shovels and fencing and all that. It'd take a couple of months to get back again once they had delivered wool. So once you were a sheep farmer, if you sheared your sheep, for example, in the Monera, your wool would go down to Eden on the coast. It would be floated up to Sydney, and then it would go overseas to England to the London wool sales for the Yorkshire mills. But it would take more than a year before you got your money for your wool. So if you went broke in the interim, that was just too bad. And that's why you had all these land companies, because they would guarantee money to the pastoralist that while he was waiting for his wool check, they would sponsor them. But if the guy went broke, they would inherit the property. That's why all these big land companies accumulated properties, because everybody was going broke, etc., etc. In the early days, everybody sheared with a blade shear. Now, I've just written an article about this, but there was 2 methods of shearing the sheep with blades. One was called the longitudinal method, and one was the circular method. In the longitudinal one, you started at their head, and you sat on a sack, and you tied the sheep's legs up, and you took the belly wool off. Then you just went from top to bottom and to get the wool off. But it wasn't designed for wool, it was designed to get the wool off. In other words, they weren't shearing for the fleece wool, they were just trying to shear the sheep. And the same thing with the circular method. They used to go around, circular, round and round, change hands and shear around the other way. But if you came out of the wool, it was at the back, the wool would get thinner and shorter as it went, and it got what they called a Van Dyke thing. It would just part down the middle because you were coming out of the wool. It might be 4 inches thick there, but less than 2 inches there, because you were lifting your shears out of the wool and cutting short. The reason for that was that the English method of shearing were designed for the sheep, because the sheep were sold as meat. We used the same English methods for meat sheep until about 1860, until the machines and that started to come in. By then, of course, we were starting to shear the sheep, not for the sheep and the meat, but we're starting to shear the sheep for the wool. And that was the problem, that the English methods were not designed for wool, they were designed for meat. Now, there's always been clippers like this. I mean, there's sort of thing on a spring like that. Just a little pair of clippers. This is a little, the blade just goes across the turn. It's called for dogs. So it's a dog clipper, like that. This is one I got in Morocco. And I know it's a sheep shear because it's got a ram stamped into it. But all handmade and a rivet down the middle. You wouldn't shear 100 sheep with that, but this is this is a pair of sheep shears from the pole. If you come up later, I can't even do that without hurting my fingers. And how they could ever shear a sheep like that, it must have gone one hair at a time. Initially, all the sheep shears were made with one. It's called a single bow. And you might have read songs about, I painted with the Wolseley's, that's the Wolseley shearing machine, and I charmed with bee bows too. A bee bow is just like that. That's the bee, see? Ding, ding. And they made over 2 pieces of sheep. That's what it looks like when it's being made, shaped out of one piece. Starts like this, and they rivet the 2 bits together. You know, when you're cutting paper with a pair of scissors, you often don't go, you sometimes go, and that's what this is for. Every pair of shears had to be doctored and had to be adapted. You can cut your hair with them when you first buy them, but what they do is they spring them up because they don't want the 2 points to meet. They don't want the 2 points to meet, and also they had a thing like that which would help you to drive it through the wool, and the 2 corks was to stop the noise, because when you were shearing next to a person with blade shears, you could hear how many, and if you wanted to quieten the noise, you put corks on them, and that's what they call, you know. And so that's what they were like. They're quite a later player, but they sort of show you like that. The big problem in Australia was that by 1860, the number of sheep had grown and grown and grown. For example, between 1860 and 1890, the number of sheep in Australia went up from 22 million to 90 million. And you couldn't keep up. You couldn't keep up the numbers of shearers. And that's why the shearing got a bit rough. The shearing got a bit rough for several reasons. One, during the gold mining days and the gold rush, everybody left the shearing sheds to make a fortune trying to find gold. And the people who were left, they said, well, we may as well make a good thing out of this. So they put their prices up. And so there was a great debate between the shearers who were left and the pastoralists, and how much the pastoralists would pay to get the wool off their sheep. You see, that's why it started getting a bit woolly. The other big problem in Australia was there was very bad supervision in the wool sheds. Many of the people supervising, and I've got an article in one of my books, that this guy left school in Melbourne. He went all the way up to Balranald, then he went all the way up to Ivanhoe, and he followed up getting off the Cobb and Co Church, and he was just 18, finished school. He got picked up by the station buggy, and that shearing, he was in charge of 150 men. There was like 70 shearers, but they also had a lot of people like penners up, wool sorters, piece pickers, all kinds of things. And so he was in shearer to make sure he got his due. And of course, they were always fighting about who sheared this and who did. And bad shearing got rattled and they didn't get paid for that. And then they had to take them all back to the paddock. So what was fighting about the rights of shearers for their horse paddocks and how many dogs they should have in the yard and how many sheep they should be accredited, and fighting with the cooks. It must have worked about 21 hours a day, and they'd have to get back the next morning and do the same thing all over again. So it was pretty hard. We normally talk about wool classing, but wool classing really was pretty poor in the 1830s, 1840s in Australia. In fact, there was great complaints in all the English papers about how badly the Australian clip was put together. They used to take the bellies off, that all urine stains and all the daggy bits from out the back, but all the rest of the fleece used to go in one big lot. In Spain, they used to divide each fleece into about 20 different lots. And so you had the same sort of wool in all the different sections. We didn't class sheep until about 1875. So in other words, if you've got a mixed lot of sheep, where you've got fine wool, medium wools and coarse wool, and if you get cross breeding with them, you've got such a terrible lot. But instead of culling them out and getting rid of them, they used to cull them out and sell them to some new chum who was going further out. And so the coarse wool still remained in the Australian clip for donkey's years afterwards. The shearing sets were very, very big and very rough, I think, too. Can you imagine? You've got 70 shearers in a hut, probably not much bigger than this. Around the edges, you've got bunks, tiers. You've got people who want to sing songs here, people who trying to go on a drunken spree, trying to go to sleep. There are people who don't like the cooking, and there's very dirt floors. It was very, very bad. I mean, the pastoralists really didn't give much help to the shearers. It was very rough living indeed. They would get up in the morning and they would shear from sunrise till breakfast time. Then they would have cups of tea. They used to live on cups of tea. Then there would be another time, and then another cup of tea, then lunch, then another couple of times, and they would knock off at say 6 o'clock or 6:30, depending when sunset was in where season you were. It was a very long day and a very tough day. Shearing is the toughest job that anybody ever does on a sheep station. It's very hard on your arms, because you have to lift the sheep up and cart it out the pen. You've got to bend over and got to manipulate. When you're manipulating a sheep, you actually have 3 different movements to keep the points down, and you'll be doing this, and not only did people have aching arms, but you had to, because it was made of one piece, it would sometimes spring out, and we call it overlapping. So you had to hold the tension on even when you opened the blades, etc., and it was very hard. You had to spend half your little tea breaks sharpening your blades, keep them sharp, and it was just a very tough job. Some sheep, of course, were maggoty. You think, what's it like? I tell you, you're talking about fly-blown sheep. I've handled a lot of fly-blown sheep. It's a terrible job. You don't know where to put your hands, and nobody wants to shake hands with you. It is a terrible job, and it's really bad for the sheep. And then, of course, you used to have lots of sheep which were, they used to be washed. Before 1875, they used to wash the sheep before they sheared it, and they did that for 3 reasons. First of all, it was easier to shear sheep with less dust and muck and vegetable matter in it. That was the first one. Secondly, you didn't have to sharpen your shears as much. And thirdly, and this was the big reason, all the wool that was taken to market was sold after the freight people had carted it by weight. And so a wagon team of horse teams or cattle team, they were charged by weight. And so if you could get rid of a lot of the weight out of the wool before you put it in the bales and packed it up, that saved you money. The thing about the paddle steamers, and that didn't sound, I'll talk about that in a minute, but that wasn't by weight. And so shearing was very hard. They used to start on a Thursday, often, so that you could get your wrists into order before the full week the next week. And they generally used to shear for half a day on a Saturday, because the amount of money you made for a half day shearing generally paid for your rations and your cook. The pastoralists used to have to feed all the piece pickers and the wool rollers and all the shed hands and all that. They got paid rain, hail or snow. But the shearers didn't. The shearers did not get paid unless they worked for it. And so if you sheared one sheep a day, you got paid for one sheep. You probably got the sack, but you sheared for one sheep. And but the shearers controlled the cook. They paid for the cook, and they paid for the rations from the pastoralists. And of course, if the pastoralists wanted to be nasty, instead of charging, so to say, 3 and 6 pence for a pair of shears, he would charge them 4 shillings. Or he could put up the price of the rations to make sure he wasn't. But the big thing was that even when wool prices went up, the shearers didn't get any extra money. And the other thing about the shearing was that as sheep got bigger, and they did get bigger from about 1860 on, shearing was a harder job. I mean, even today, I was in a shed helping a friend, and they had big 4-year-old border Leicester ewes. I could barely lift one off the floor. They're massive things. And the same thing with bigger sheep. In fact, when they used to have big wether sheep in the Western District, which is sort of west of the Darling, they used to pay them extra money to shear them because they realized that the work was much harder. You couldn't shear as many, and it was much more grinding to do that. A bit about the paddle steamers. The big problem with the Western rivers was it was owned by New South Wales. Sydney controlled the Lachlan, the Castlereagh, all these major rivers, the Darling, the Murrumbidgee, the Birrabong Creek, and all, they controlled it, but it didn't get any money from them because they couldn't get any of the wool to flow down towards Sydney. There was no way to flow the rivers to Sydney. All the rivers flowed down to Adelaide. And so that's why Adelaide did so well out of the wool season, because all the river traffic finished up in Adelaide. And so they were making screwage from that. The big thing about, there was 2 big things, but one big thing was, if the wool barges were not self-propelled, they were towed by a paddle steamer. And you could sometimes put 900 bales on the one little barge. And you might have 2 or 3 barges that were just towed along behind a power steamboat. But you could sometimes take more than 2,000 bales at the one time down the river, whereas you could barely get 20 or 30 bales on a wagon to take that, and you couldn't unhitch your horses double harnessing. Just a terrible job. And the other thing, of course, about the Darling was you had to allow for, say, you just take Dunlop Station in 1888, you had to allow for providing food for an extra 100 people on your property. So you had to import lots and lots of rations. If the river was low, you couldn't get your rations up the street, and then you had to pay a person who would charge you by weight to bring it by wagon trade. And then when you're shearing, did you ever, perhaps you don't know, but all the water in the Darling River flows southward from Queensland, and the rain falls in December, January, February. And if there's no water up in Queensland, there's no water in the Darling. And if there's no water in the Darling, the barges don't go. They talk about all the rivers flow, but they don't always flow, and you sometimes get very badly stuck. That's why Victoria did so well. Victoria, they thought, if we can get a railway line up to Echuca, we can get hold of all the Murrumbidgee and the upper Murray trade, and we can divert all the wool down to Melbourne. And that's what they did. And they did the same thing by building a railway line to Albury. It was very difficult building a railway line across the Blue Mountains. It took until 1878 to get the railway line to Goulburn, you know what that is, and another 2 or 3 years to get it to Wagga. But because the people in New South Wales didn't want all the Wagga trade to go to Albury, instead of building the railway line from Wagga to Albury, they built it westward to Narrandera to try and get hold of the Murrumbidgee trade. And then they built another railway line up to Burke in 1881 to get hold of the Darling trade. But once the railways got involved, the river trade disappeared completely. And that was very romantic, but not very good. Now, as I said, by the time we got to 1886, there was a big need for shearers. And this is about the first shearing machine. It wasn't. The first shearing machine was patented by an Englishman called James Andrew Hyam Bolton. Bolton Hyam, his name, James Andrew Bolton Hyam. And he designed this shearing machine, but it never ever went into production. I got a funny story about that, because I discovered the original documents in the La Trobe Library here in Melbourne. And the fellows, I said, can I get a copy of this? He actually helped me to photocopy it. And then a couple of weeks later, a fellow from the library rang up and said, somebody said you know where the original documents are for the first shearing handpiece in Australia. I said, where do you work? He said, I work in the La Trobe Library. He said, I said, are you in the manuscripts department? He said, yes. I said, well, they're probably about 30 feet away from where you're sitting. So that was quite fun. But this was a design that was put up by a guy called Riley, and it was copied by a guy called Wolseley. Now, Frederick Wolseley was an interesting fellow. His father was Irish, and you've probably heard of his brother. His brother was Garnet Wolseley. Have you ever seen that film Cartoon with, you know, where the British Army were all isolated up the Nile and they tried to save them? It was Wolseley who went to rescue them, and that was Wolseley, the shearing machine man's brother. He was later the governor of Cyprus, and he was a very famous soldier. And his brother, I suppose, got sent out to the colonies. But he wasn't an engineer, but he could see a good thing when he saw it. And he really bought other people's patent rights. Anybody that threatened to take him over, he just bought the patent right and produced it. And so this is a Riley machine. It was copied by Wolseley, and 2 years later he was using the same patent to advertise this stuff. Now this happened, the first shed in Australia to complete a shearing with mechanical shearing was at Yama Station at Collie Amberley. And all the shearers were very aggressively against machinery, because all the advertising said, pick up a machine, you can shear 100 without even trying. and you won't cut the sheep, it's so much easier. Oh, the nonsense, of course. The only shearers who could shear 100 were people who could shear 100 with blades and knew how to handle the sheep. And so the whole thing was, there was a lot of false advertising. But the Yama station was the first to finish because they had smaller sheep. It wasn't the first shearing shed to start, because that was the Dunlop station. They had more sheep, it took longer, so they started in July, finished in October. Yama started in August and finished in September. They had lots of troubles with the first shearing shed. Although when the shearers first arrived at Dunlop station, it's right on the Darling River, all the sheds were all set up with mechanical gear, so they must have known they were going to be expected to shear with machines, but they weren't arguing about machines. The unions had just come in, they were arguing about who was going to control the sheds. Now, prior to the unions taking place in 1886, it had been the pastoralist boss who controlled the sheds. And he used to have made them sign a document, like a working contract, and if they broke the contract, they could be sued or taken to court, fined or put in jail. And that didn't go down well, but the pastoralists controlled the whole of shearing. But after the unions got going in 1886, they started to take more and more control over the shearing sheds. In other words, they would be in charge of the shearing, the conditions, etc., 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 and it has been ever since. One of these. And so this machine came in, and it was surprising because as soon as it came in, everybody copied them. Now, this is you just take it down. This is the Wolseley, probably about 1900. And in 1906, Burke & Ball discovered that the Wolseley company had let their patent rights run out. And so they produced one exactly the same. And so it was a dead set copy. And then in 1907, Lister, they got a man who had been shearing at Dunlop called Davidson, and it says, and Davidson went to Gloucestershire with a plan of the Wolseley machine in his head. And I thought, I bet he had one in his pocket just to remind him. And so in 1912, you had Wolseley produced a machine, Burke & Ball produced a machine, and Lister, and they were all exactly the same. And they used to advertise every part fully interchangeable. And so they should have been, because they were all dead set copies of each other. In the earlier days, you see, you didn't need power, apart from hard power to do that. But when you got machines, they generally had a steam engine with a belt and a whole line of shafting with friction wheels. It's a bit like, that's a friction wheel here. You remember when, you're all old enough to remember, when you had lights on a bicycle and you wanted to get your light to work, you flicked the little dynamo onto the back wheel and the friction turned the little wheel and gave you power for the light. Do you remember that? Perhaps I'm too old. Anyway, this is about, they've got a friction wheel, which is about that size, with a flange on it, and when you pull the machine into gear, you pull this onto that, and it spins around, and whereas it started off at 550 revolutions on the shaft, got faster to 600, 650, it's going at 3,350 at the bottom. In other words, they're illegal, these things today, but they had a pin drive. You would have a metal tube attached to this down the bottom, or like that, 4 foot long, and it would be spinning at at 3,250 revolutions a minute down the bottom. Down here, there's a little roller which changes the spinning motion into an oscillation motion across. So that machine is going double, going 6,500 times across like that. Is it dangerous? Is it never? Very dangerous. And so you have to hang on to it. And so that's what it's about. The thing that sort of surprises me is that every time somebody develops some new idea, everybody would copy. Now this idea is that what you've got is you've got a cutting blade, which that's called a comb, and the comb is fixed onto the body of the machine, called a sheared body, and then there's a cutter that is held in position with three little flanges there, and to get the tension on it, you screw, these are the show. What you do is you screw the tension nut down on what is called a tension sleeve. These things never come on. Here we are. That's a tension sleeve. The tension sleeve puts pressure on a pin, and so you're screwing that down and you're putting pressure on. And what you're doing is you're actually pushing the cutter harder onto the comb. If you push it too hard on the comb, of course, the whole thing just gets so hot. And that's why they call them a hot box. You ever heard of a shearing machine called a hot box? It was because they were screwing the things down too tightly, and the whole thing was heating up in the person's hand, giving them, I'm not looking at the time, here we are, giving them blisters. The shearing industry employed more people in Australia than almost anything. And what I want you to get at is that by 1890, it was more than 2 or 3 times the whole cost of gold and silver and money put together, 3 times. The amount of wool being produced in Australia was absolutely ginormous. And it was, the price of the individual wool didn't go up, but they were producing so much more of it. I mean, I was talking about Milo Station before. Milo Station, which is one property, produced 5,600 bales per season. That's a lot of wool. Can you imagine a bale with 400 pounds of wool in it like that, and you're producing 5,600? Just incredible. Now, somebody talked about, before the thing, talking about narrow gearing and gear. When shearers at Dunlop were shearing with blades, it took 37 of them to keep the wool scar going in a day. There were 37 shearers shearing flat out, produced enough wool to keep the wool scar going for one day. When they started shearing in 1888, in July 1888, it only took 24 shearers to keep the wool scar going. So it was a lot quicker. The same thing, white combs. Everybody produced a white comb in 1912. It wasn't a New Zealand idea in the year 1970. Everybody in 1912 had white combs. There was Walter had a white comb, Lister had a white comb, Moffat Verger had a white comb, Stewart had white combs. The thing about Stewart is that it started off as the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company, and they became the people who produced Sunbeam Mixmasters and stuff like that. Same company, Sunbeam. The Stewart Company became the Sunbeam Company was derived from the thing. So it's very interesting. But white combs were not liked by the pastoralists. In 1926, they thought that the shearers going too hard were knocking all the wrinkles off the merinos, and so they were banned. And in the 1950s, they were also banned by the unions because they didn't want Tom Brown with narrow gear, shearing less than 25% than his mate, M-E-T-E, with a wide comb. They wanted everybody to be the same. And for that reason, shearing unions did not like wide combs or narrow combs. I mean, the big debate with the New Zealanders in the 1970s had nothing to do with wide combs. It had to do with who was going to control the Australian Workers' Union. I mean, it was very strong. I mean, when I jackarooed, there must have been 5 or 6 supervisors in the Wagga district. Now they've got about 1 in New South Wales and 1 in Queensland. It's just, there's less than 10% of the Australian Workers' Union involved in the pastoral industry now. But in the 19th century, wool was it. I mean, wool controlled the finances, it controlled the land, all these major properties. That was huge properties. It wasn't until the resumption of land for the railways and stuff like that, the property started to get broken up. Soldier settlement. I mean, soldier settlement was a disaster because they never gave the soldiers who were trying to settle large enough blocks of land. In some places you need 50,000 acres to make a living. In other places 5,000 acres. But if you're given 5,000 acres in an area where you need 50, you are not going to do it. Secondly, the soldier settlers often didn't have enough experience to work the land. And thirdly, they didn't have enough capital to pay for all the things they needed for fencing and workers. It was a very tough job and they did very well, but people often didn't know much about it. I know when I was jackaroo, we were trying to help this fellow, who was a soldier settler, and we were doing some cropping, and we were just about to set fire to the shoot paddock, about 600 acres, and we've got the fire going, and we're going around setting fire to all the top grass. He said, I haven't got the sheep out yet. My boss said, you're going to have a lot of roasted mutton in this. So we're running around and dense smoke, chasing these jolly sheep out. And the boss was really angry. He said, you would have thought that he might have got the sheep out of the paddock when we told him we were coming to set fire to it. So that was all one of these kind of things. This one here, and I'll finish with this. There was a company who tried to get away from the oscillating blade across the fixed curve. And that's because they tried to have, called part, it was called part rotor shear. And what the idea was, you had a fixed cartridge and you had this spinning wheel, cutter, which went round and round, and it was a new idea. It was a very good idea, and it was excellent for cattle. You could do things with cattle and trim them up. But I had a family fight and they went broke. One of these sad things I want to say is that people have fantastic ideas, and then something gets in the way, and that's a rotor shear. This one is powered by one of these things here with a pin, but this one was powered by compressed air, which is a good idea. And of course, when you did that, that was a left-hand thing, but what you can do is you can unscrew it and put it there if you happen to be left-handed. Now you can get left-handed shears. I got a pair of left-handed shears at home. It's not like a left-handed screwdriver. But when I worked for SKF, used to always be boys coming in for a tin of tartan paint, but it must be half pint. Or they'd go for a left-handed screwdriver. But you see, if you watch, when I pull the shear toward me, the top blade comes over the lower blade, see that? But in a left-hand pair of shears, see, it's got to come that way to left-handed. So they do make left-handed shears. This was a marvelous invention, the invention of the sheep shearing machine. It was the first place in Australia to actually do it. And the reason for that was, in England, the sheep flocks were only about 20 or 30. Every sheep had a name, and you had 40 local people to shear. It was a festival. And in America, they had native Indians and Navajo Indians and Mexican people who would do all the shearing. And so there was no need for the development of the machine. But in Australia, we didn't have that, so we did develop the machine, and we were right to the forefront. Wolseley, of course, left Australia in 1890 and took the company to London and Birmingham, and they kept on shearing, producing them there. We really didn't produce many Australian sheep shearing machines, but the Muffet Virtue was one, and that was made by two Scotsmen who lived in Australia. That's a Heineken, that's a European model, and as you can see, they haven't changed much in 150 years, not much at all. All the basic principles are all the same. There was a New Zealand model called a Streamliner, and that was good. They're very heavy. If you come up and lift one up, quite heavy to hold, shearing a sheep and controlling the things. Now, perhaps I should just leave it there. I've gone on for long enough. But any questions? Oh, in the slip. Yes, please.
I remember seeing on Landline quite a few years ago about this method where they put the sheep in sort of an orange bag, and then they'd inject all the sheep.
Yes, that's right.
Shed
That's
their
right.
fleece.
I've got one of these bags at home. It was a chemical method. The idea was it was made out of some byproduct of soya beans. They would inject the sheep and put a net on them. And the reason they had the net on was because after a set period of time, the chemical reaction would take place and the wool would just fall off. You'd be a bit like a person after chemotherapy, you know, just like that. And the problem was that they had to keep the net on the sheep for a couple of weeks until the wool started to regrow. Otherwise, they would die of frostbite or sunburn. And the other thing was they weren't quite sure if injecting ewes would increase or decrease the fertility of the breeding animals on the place. But I can see that they've started off again, but that's why they stopped it. One of these things. But in New Zealand, they used to, so we're at the bottom of the garden here. In New Zealand, they put this on the bottom of the cone. It's called a snow cone. It's so that when you shear the sheep, you're leaving 5 millimeters of wool on the sheep so that they don't die of frostbite in not South Island, you know. That's what that is. It's a snow cone. And that was, that little bit there, they call it a finger grip, but if you're left-handed, you had to call it a thumb grip. One of these things. There's all funny things going around. So, any more questions? All asleep? Yeah.
How many sheep would Australia have now?
Not nearly as many, but you have to look at the numbers. A lot of sheep in Australia are not shorn anymore. A lot of sheep are produced for meat and or the wool, like Romney Marsh, crossbred sheep, fat lambs. The wool is just a byproduct and is really shuffled aside. Or you might have sheep that don't require shearing. But I think it's probably less than 100 million now, but it's partly to do with seasons. I mean, up in Queensland, a lot of the big stations, Wellshot for example, first place to have merino sheep in Queensland, there's hardly a sheep to be seen. And from Normandy all the way down, I mean, I went to see some huge stations out from Balranald, and there's not a sheep on the property. So it's all changed. I think in a sense, Australia produced the most fantastic wool, the best wool possible, but we don't seem to be able to market it. And if you don't market it, you may as well not sell it. That's the problem, isn't it? Does that answer the question? Yes. But it's gone down a lot, and there's not so much interest. The properties are smaller, and you haven't got as much scope to run big flocks. And so the smoke, and also the number of shearers have decreased tremendously. And it's quite difficult these days.
But merino is still seen as one of the best wools, isn't it? And
Oh yeah.
and certainly in use of wool, they're
Yes,
now
it
able
was
to spin it to the finest.
Yes, it was developed by the Arabs, and especially the Arabs in Spain. And the problem was, in 1807, when the French invaded Spain, the French generals didn't provide food for their soldiers, and so they were eating up all the merinos. And so the American ambassador sent a lot of sheep to America, were called Vermont, and then we imported them back to these very wrinkly merinos that Mackay had at the Royal Easter Show in 1900. And then there was another breed of them went to France called the Rambouillet, which was directly, and we got a few too, because King George III got a lot of sheep from Spain. But our main supply of sheep came from the Spanish merinos that went to Cape Town, Cape Colony, and it was a Dutch colony, and the commander was a fellow called Gordon, of Scotch extraction, and he lost the colony, Cape Colony, to the British, and felt so badly about it, committed suicide, and his wife sold the flock, the Spanish merino flock, to Woodhouse and Kent. Now Kent was Hunter's nephew, and he got 23 sheep, but lost them all coming to Australia. But Henry Waterhouse, who's related to Gay Waterhouse, the horse trainer, and he got all his sheep to Australia, and it was from him, Waterhouse, that MacArthur had bought his sheep. But he mixed them up with a lot of sheep that came from, they were called Bengal sheep, but they're actually from Kashmir. And they were shipped out of Bengal. And after a couple of breedings, he would say they're purebred merinos. He sold hundreds of them to Tasmanians. But the reality was, after about 6 breedings, you would get these hairy little lambs coming, because they were Bengali sheep and not purebred merinos. They were a bit of a spoof, actually, one of these things. Now there's a lot to learn. We're all learning all the time.
You've got an awful lot in your head, I must say.
No, it's not in my head. But it's a fascinating subject. And of course, if you try to see this expansion from the other side of the Aboriginal side of it, it's a kind of disaster, in the sense that the British European people were producing more and more sheep, going everywhere, up to Queensland in the 1850s, and west, everywhere. Everything was turned into sheep pastures, but every acre that they occupied was one less acre for the resident Aboriginals. It was part of that European supremacy thing, which we look upon in a different light today. But if you look at it, a bit like my Scottish ancestors being overrun by the Romans, yeah, it's part of history. You just sort of try to fight as hard as you can not to get overrun. But it was a really bad thing. And then of course there's all sorts of things about Chinese shearers getting abused and etc. And it's really quite a thing. The British were very heavily involved in the wool industry in Australia. They could see a good dollar or quid being made. They invested very heavily. And of course, when they had the great drought between 1888 and 1903, that was a 15-year drought, talking about droughts, and all the British pulled their money out, leaving people hanging with properties they couldn't sell. And one of these kind of things.
James, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. We're very lucky to have had you here at the library tonight. We have a very small gift for you.
Oh.
So I'll just give you that.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Now I hope that among all the talk you can grab something that you might recollect is worth following up. But it's a fascinating thing. I mean, books. I say there's a book there that the library's got by Charlie Massey on the Merino. It's like a doorstop. I know Charlie very well, lives at Severn Station down near Dalgety, down south of Cooma. It's a fantastic book. That's good. The one about Frank Clune, about the Golden Fleece, it's a tremendous book. And Russell Ward, by the Australian Legend, that's a good book on shearing. And there's fantastic books on sheep and wool. Lots and lots of books on sheep and wool. Thank you.
Everything you can see in the cabinet is for loan as well.
Yes, so you can tell them, you can hear everything in the cabinets on wool is for loan, if you're interested, and of course there's some wonderful books here.
Yeah, just brought in case somebody wants to follow it up. They're $40 each. Thank you.
There you go. So
I won't touch the book at all. You won't shake hands either.
So if you've enjoyed this tonight, we have events every month in the evening and lots of events during the day, during the week, book sales and book clubs and family history groups and all sorts of other things. So if you're interested in joining or hearing more about the library, give your name to Lauren or Ellen before you leave, and you can find us on the web as well. So thank you again, James, very much. There's still tea, coffee, biscuits there if anyone feels like any more. And thank you again